showing them that we can provision an environment, 0 to everything in 15 minutes.
I hope everybody can hear okay. If anybody at the back cannot hear, then please let me know. And apologies if I come across a little bit nervous. I've never done a talk for more than probably 30 people before, and and that's the reason why. It makes me very nervous. The other thing, which I think was one of the reasons I agreed to come and talk at this, is because James said there were, a lot of what would be happening today would be talks about the smaller details that build up into something perhaps greater than the sum of their parts. I find myself really interested in the smaller details. But when that comes to kind of creating a bigger picture out of those small details, I really struggle. So being here now, I have all the small details in my head, but trying to kind of bring them all together into some sort of narrative is not something I find easy at any point in time, much less than when there's a large crowd of people looking at me and perhaps expecting some sort of narrative. Even better. My name is Evin, and I'm from the Kernel Brewery, as James has perhaps introduced me already. Well, okay, let's start at the very back. I mean, the title for this conference is obviously Homebrew, and that's where it started for me. The brewery's been going commercially since 2009, and it was about 2007, so 2 years before that I started brewing at home. What led me to get into beer was a number of different things. I suppose one of the main influences was my previous job. I worked as a cheesemonger. I sold cheese at Neil's Yard Dairy. They have a cheese shop in Covent Garden where I used to work. At that point in time, they had a customer in New York who needed some help to set up a cheese shop. It's one of the things that Americans don't boast about being the best at. No, it's true, they don't. So I went over there for a couple of months to help this company over there set up a cheese shop. And I suppose the first part of my journey was, if you imagine day-to-day life, I'd be taking all the staff in there and teaching them about cheese. I'd tell them, the name of this cheese, what style it is, what's its historical importance, what sort of milk they would use, from what animals, grazing on what pastures, with what sorts of mix of microorganisms, etc., coming up with this sort of cheeses. And then we'd taste through the cheese, we'd discuss what we were tasting, and this was all exactly how I would treat cheese here in my normal day-to-day life in London. And then every evening we'd go out for a beer. And the guys I was working with would tell me exactly the same things about the beer we were drinking. Not to do with the milk, obviously. But who made it, what's the historical recipe, what sort of hops are used in this, why it's important, why it's delicious, where it's made. And so much of the food that I ate and the things that I drank, I would know this information about. But beer was something that was just a great big black hole in my knowledge, despite the amount I consumed. There's something that the Americans do celebrate when they get hold of something, a certain enthusiasm that had kind of taken over beer in the States at that point in time, which wasn't visible to me at that point in London. That's obviously changed a huge amount now. Hopefully we'll see some of us talking about that change in the film we're going to see a little bit later. But having been exposed to this in the States, and it was an exposure not just to the beers over there, but also to people's enthusiasm towards the beers. Americans are able to create and generate and promulgate that sort of enthusiasm towards something that they find, well, all of us should find, I suppose, worthy of that sort of attention. So there were beers worthy of a certain attention, and there was a certain attention given to those beers. which was something that I had not seen in my drinking life in London. So I came home and started homebrewing. I started off making 15 liters in the kitchen. That kind of graduated on to making 50 liters in the garden. I'd make a batch a week. And at that sort of point in time, homebrewing meant just that for itself, in itself. Changing recipes, experimenting, not being terribly scientific about narrowing things down, not being too precious about anything, but just getting into the rhythm of the way things work, the way things taste, the way things move on and develop. 2 years of that. I started the first. We've moved brewery 3 years ago, but we started off with a 600-liter kit on Druid Street, so just south of Tower Bridge. And at that point in time, I think there were about 10 breweries in London. There were 3 sort of production breweries. That's including Budweiser, Fuller's, who are a big, long-standing family brewery here, who make excellent beers. Meantime, had been going for about 7 or 8 years. Who were the first of the new wave ones, or at least the ones that survived. There was another brewery, Sandbrooks, who had started up in Wandsworth in South London, and then there were 5 or 6 brew pubs. And nowadays, must be about 90 breweries now. Have you any numbers? So yeah, in the space of 6 years, things have changed quite a lot. And that's quite miraculous to see. Because, I don't know, it gives a lot of people a lot of good beer to drink, I suppose. So just going back to that that was just the bare bones of how things progressed. I think there's a couple of interesting things to say about, I suppose, the way that happened. I think for me, working in Neil's Yard selling cheese was really fascinating for a number of reasons, and most of them are still really important to me. The idea of tasting things and having that as the reason and the motivation behind what you do, to not just use your analytical senses in terms of thinking or in terms of what you hear or in terms of what you're told or in terms of what you think you should think, just being able to taste and let the sensation, be something that guides you in terms of your decision-making processes. It's hard because we're all influenced by the outside world and by other people's opinions and by the time of day or our moods or the weather or the temperature. And it's, it's very difficult to base any form of decision on something as ephemeral as taste. But working through Neil's Yard, every day you go in the morning and you taste every cheese that's on sale that day because it's not the same as yesterday. And you're not the same as yesterday. And it means that you are aware, always, of the fluctuations and the changes, and things aren't constant. Things don't taste the same every day. And you have to be aware of that, and you have to not be, you don't tell a customer that this cheddar is lovely and sweet and nutty because that's what you tasted yesterday. You taste it today. You make sure that you know what it is, and then you comment on or think about how that reflects on what it tasted like yesterday. And it's something that we still try and hold to as far as possible. The other thing at Neil's Yard that I learned was also to do with quality. Your judge of that, your judgment of quality obviously comes through your taste buds, through flavor. And you have standards, and you don't let them slip. Because without that, what do you have left? you have to kind of strive to be the best at all possible times. But it is also, there's a humanity involved in working with people, which means that that's quite a difficult thing to maintain, because it happens with us. When we work with our suppliers, it happens more often there. Because, for example, if you have a cheesemaker who has a problem, for example, the weather's really bad, the grass gets really wet, becomes quite damp, cows are eating damp grass, the milk becomes a little bit musty. The cheese then that results from that is not as good as it should be. I mean, you've worked with this guy for 20 years. You don't just chuck it out the window. You know, you still have to be able to help people across those sort of humps. And we have the same thing with our suppliers. You know, things are not consistent. We're working with, you know, products that are grown naturally. They experience variation year to year, day to day, batch to batch, farm to farm. And those are sort of things that we always have to live with, at the same time as trying to keep the sort of levels of quality that we want. I think the other thing about working with, from working with Neil's Yard is that with them, I suppose, we have built up a really strong sense of community. When we moved to our present location, we moved as a collective. So down there now, around the brewery, there's a group of maybe 20 businesses, all food producers, and all of the very best quality. So our direct neighbor on this side is a butcher. We have a coffee roaster on that side, the guys who make jam, an importer of Italian charcuterie and cheese, the London Honey Company, a bakery, another bakery, 2 veg guys, 3 more cheese importers, a cheese maker, and 3 natural wine importers. I think that covers most everybody. And an ice cream, 2 ice cream. They don't turn up in winter sometimes because it's a bit cold, but they appear in the summer in force. And that's our family. So all these guys are working in railway arches next to us. We're in a railway arch like this, just a little bit taller, but about the same width, and a bit longer too. And what you can do together is obviously so much more than you can do on your own. So collectively, you know, we can rent this amount of space with more security, and we have a little bit more leverage because we're a large organization rather than lots of little individual ones. And we all have the same focus on what we do, even if we're doing different things. So we share a huge amount of customers, for example. So if we're not selling to the same restaurants or to the same bars or to the same shops. So there's an amazing passage of people that will come down to visit one of us, and then they'll end up kind of hanging around with the guy next door, or vice versa. We can share deliveries. Yeah, and we can throw really quite nice parties when we want to. I think we have most everything down there that we would need. But again, the focus is tight, and you know there are certain rules and restrictions that we all abide by to make it kind of what it is. The whole idea down there is that everybody has to be a producer, in the sense that it's not retail focused. We do open up for retail, but only on Saturdays. All of us open Saturday mornings from 9 o'clock until 2. And that's a market. I suppose that's precisely what it is. But it's a market in kind of a more old-fashioned sense. A lot of us had experience, for example, working at Borough Market, which at a point in time was really excellent and provided exactly what people needed in terms of what they wanted to buy. But the popularity of the market kind of turned into something that became, I suppose, kind of shopping as a form of entertainment. People would go down and take photographs and wander around and hang out and, grab a burger or grab a cup of coffee or a beer and wander around. People are not interacting with Borough Market anymore as a place to buy things, to take home, to cook with. And in order for that not to happen to where we are, we have strict rules, for example, about there's no hot food and no takeaways in terms of drinking beer on site, or there's nothing to entertain you in the sense of just, just a thing to do for an afternoon, because that really, to me, kind of defeats the kind of essence, I suppose, of what it is we're trying to do down there. I usually do talks like this, kind of around tastings of different beers, but it's quite difficult to get everybody served at the same time. But about the beers we make, I think it's really quite interesting for me to try and find the thread that takes it back to when I made beers at home. But I think a number of principles kind of still, well, no, have they? I think when I was homebrewing, I used to do quite a lot of everything, and not terribly well. And now, I think basically we just make 3 styles of beer. We make pale beers like the one we're trying, which is a table beer at 3%. We make a pale ale at 5% and an IPA at 7%, which are, in essence, or at least in one essence, the same beer. In other essences, they're quite different. But the simplicity to those is that it's really just one type of pale English malted barley, often one type of hops. This is a beer made entirely with mosaic hops from the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and one type of very clean yeast. But with that simplicity, there are an endless number of different things you can express. The alcohol changes the expression. So as you jump up to 5%, and we have an IPA out there at 7%, which again with similar hops will express very different things. Alcohol just brings out creaminess, richness, depth. Whereas a beer at 3% is obviously much more about refreshment, kind of light, air, space. We make dark beers. All the dark beers we make are old London recipes. It's great to be excited about all the new things that are happening in beer and all the, say the new discoveries. When I first discovered beer from other places, or even from here, that I never knew existed. But in London, there's a huge old tradition of brewing that goes back centuries and centuries. London was the place where, I suppose, the Industrial Revolution started, with the breweries in London becoming the first factories, I suppose, that became massive on such a scale that it kind of, led to a break with the artisan ways of doing things before. I mean, that's not the way we run our brewery, but it's really interesting for us to try and figure out what that means as far as brewing in London goes. So the beers that we brought today, a porter, which is made to an 1856 recipe from Barclay Perkins, which was, at that point in time, the biggest brewery in the world. And it was based just where Shakespeare's Globe is now, on the south bank of the Thames. It's funny that, because they kind of pretend Shakespeare's Globe has been there since Shakespeare's time, but it hasn't. It was a brewery. I don't know what 5 minutes means anymore. That's the problem. I suppose the other types of beer we make are sour beers. We've got one out there, which is a Berliner Weiss, which is a clean, simple, sour. It tastes on its own a little bit like, it's like a lemonade without any sugar. Just clean, crisp, light, refreshing, bang. We've got a version out there with raspberries in it, which is tasty, and only 3%. I think James alluded to earlier the joy of drinking beer that it's not excessively strong. And there are certain beers and certain styles that make that, I think, work particularly well. 5 minutes, okay. I think in all the kind of the journey from homebrew to a brewery and to where we are now. So now there's 13 of us. Instead of making 20 liters a week at home, we make about 3,200 a day, 5 days a week. So it's about 16,000 liters a week. What's that in pints? 30,000 pints a week? If you think in pints, I don't know. I much prefer these glasses. Pints are way too big. So, it's a serious concern. But like I said before, I'd have great difficulties kind of creating narrative arcs. So when I started, I had no idea where it was going. Not that I was naive or anything, I think, but there wasn't that much of a plan. Beyond... It's strange. I had an email today asking, was there a particular pressure on microbrewers, referring to as if that was one of the things you had to struggle with as a microbrewery, was to be turning down advances from AB InBev. I don't know what kind of world we'd be living in if that was the case. Imagine if that was your worst fear, waking up in the morning. It's like, oh no, not Budweiser knocking on the door again, offering me millions. It's true. I got really. Yeah. But the blocks have kind of built from, a small beginning. But what I kind of really enjoy about working these days is that even though the company's got a little bit bigger and bigger, slowly and slowly, nothing has actually changed too much. So kind of from one person running around and doing every job, there's now 13 of us that run around and do every job. Not all at the same time, usually, although that sometimes happens. But for example, we have a very flat structure. So there's 13 of us, we all take turns brewing, we can all drive the forklift, we all answer the telephone, what other jobs do we do? Bottling, mostly bottling. It's mostly bottling. We all move things around the warehouse, take deliveries, take orders. We're all pretty much, as far as possible, involved in most decisions that we make. So everything is done quite collectively in that fashion. And that means everybody's involved and engaged with the whole process from top to bottom at every single level. There's no anybody kind of feeling superior to somebody else because they have a job or a title which kind of makes them feel like they don't have to do the menial tasks. We all take turns cleaning the kitchen and cleaning the toilets. I think that works for us to be able to create quite a really well-knit team that, everybody is slightly interchangeable, but everybody feels as much a part of the whole as everybody else. And that's kind of one of the reasons as well to not get too much bigger, because I don't know if that sort of system would work at a much larger scale. I don't want to be running a company that's much bigger. I dislike complications. I like looking at the small details, as I've said, and I like being able to brew and to bottle and drive a forklift rather than do reams of paperwork. And the responsibility of looking after lots of people is often weighs on my shoulders. The other reason for not moving is because, again, we have a great community around us. We're limited by the space we have, and that's what we have, what we can work with. If we wanted to move, we could move outside, further out, with a big industrial unit, and make lots of beer. And it, in one sense, would be fine. But in another sense, well, you're taking yourself away from your friends, and they're a lot of the reason why it's enjoyable to go into work every morning. I think I've said enough. Thanks for having me.